And we're live. Hello and welcome to UX Transitions, where I talk with guests who have made a career change into UX. I'm Robert Crane. My guest today grew up in Japan and the US. He studied architecture at the Iowa University in the US and at the Berlin University of Applied Sciences in Germany. He served as an architectural designer and associated architect for almost 8 years before transitioning to UX. Welcome, Brandon Perrson.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for having me. I'm super honored to be on your podcast, and I'm really glad you decided to kind of embark on this project, given that you've had great interactions with so many different students over your career. And I kind of think, when I was thinking back on this, when you reached out initially, I was thinking this would be a great resource to have when I was first starting out, just like easy access to, folks that are on a similar journey. And I think that would have been really helpful for me. So I'm glad that you're doing this, and I hope that, listeners will find this helpful in their journey to transitioning to the field. So thank you.
Brandon, happy to hear that. Let's start with the first question. What in your words is UX and why does it matter?
Yeah, it's a good question. Such a broad question, right? And I think I was thinking about this a bit, and like maybe one good way to frame it is thinking about what UX is philosophically. And I think a lot of what UX has to do is around simplifying complexity, right? Our world is increasingly complex. It's exponentially growing every day. And as humans, we're not quite equipped to deal with that amount of complexity as it grows. And, to deal with that, we create tools, and those tools help us make sense of the world. And so those tools and systems we build should be powerful and help augment our lived experience, but they should also be as simple as possible to use. And I think that's really where UX comes into play. And it really matters, today, because, we're just burdened with so much information. We have so little time. We have so many options. And I think we often default to this path of least resistance as a necessity, right? And I think oftentimes that leads to less than ideal outcomes. And I think one example that comes to mind is kind of like the American healthcare system, right? So for instance, if I want to book an appointment with a doctor, there's that user journey is just fraught with all kinds of friction, to the point where a lot of people just give up and they don't go to the doctor. And so I think simplifying that complexity is this kind of key mantra of UX that I think that distills, a lot of its principles for sure.
You grew up in Japan and the US. Could you share with us how it shaped you as a person and if it had any effect on your choices as a professional?
Yeah, it certainly has. And it's really hard to articulate it because it's a lot of it is subconscious to a degree, I think. And I grew up in between cultures, bouncing back and forth between the two countries during my childhood. And I really found that it was definitely alienating in a lot of respects. I never really felt fully integrated in either culture. I felt, rather as an outsider, if you will. But I think that experience helped really broaden my perception of reality, and gain this greater sense of empathy for how different people can really be. And just being able to see things from multiple lenses. And I think that's a superpower of any designer, right? It's not really special to my lived experience, but just ability to over time be able to walk in others' shoes and be able to see where they're coming from and deeply understand kind of their needs and things like that. And I think I was privileged enough to have that experience just growing up in two different cultures, just being able to see that firsthand. So I think in that sense, it really influenced just kind of how I grew up, and really probably had this subconscious impact on me gravitating toward design as a profession.
You have served as an architectural designer at two well-known names in the architectural industry in the US. What attracted you to architecture and inspired you to become an architect? And what have you learned that you now apply in your role as a product designer?
I think what initially attracted me to architecture was that experience, that cross-cultural experience growing up. I lived in a lot of different places as a child, just moving back and forth. I've lived everywhere from these on a military base in concrete boxes designed by engineers. So not the greatest experience. I've also lived in traditional Japanese homes. Definitely accounted more for the environment around, natural light, things like that. And, lived in American suburbia, and all those experiences really, I think, instilled this sense of how the built environment really has an impact on kind of who you are and how you identify. And I think somehow like that influenced my decision toward architecture. This is interest in like how different spaces can really influence who you think you are. And in terms of how I apply that in my role as a product designer, I think a lot of takeaways from, and we might get into this a little bit later, is that, there's a lot of parallels between the architectural design process and the product design process. And I think one big parallel that overlaps there is this sense of like cross-disciplinary engagement and collaboration. And I think, and this kind of ties into like the my childhood experiences of like, having this empathy of understanding people with different goals and different ways of thinking, and just being able to engage them. Like, for example, as a designer, right, you're going to speak to engineers who oftentimes have a totally different mindset around a certain deliverable. And so I had a lot of experience around that in architecture. And I think that's definitely something I apply to my role as a product designer today.
There are many examples of architects and designers who express their mixed heritage in their work. You too grew up in mixed cultures and later worked in architecture and product design. Is it inevitable for people in the creative industries to express that diversity in their work or within their working environment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I have the privilege of working in a company where we have employees from a diverse set of backgrounds and from all kind of walks of life. And I kind of take that for granted. And I think that like just being around this diversity of lived experience has been really a great contribution to work in the sense that we all have different perspectives and we have to be open to other people's ideas and be able to push back on things when it makes sense, and be accepting when it's, when things are different than how we perceive. But in terms of like this need to express or somehow imbue like a sense of like I have this cultural upbringing or background into my work, I would say like in product design, I haven't encountered a situation where I felt like I needed to. I think that might also come with experience as well. Especially, I think I've a little over a year of experience as a product designer, so I haven't really found a need to do that. By nature of the environment I work in is quite diverse already, but I could definitely see, people needing to express that a bit in maybe more homogenous environments.
What was the reason for you to transition to UX?
I think there's probably several factors. I think I've always had this interest in interface design, even as an architect, and how things are presented. As an architect, I spend a lot of time doing visual diagrams and renderings and things like that to articulate the design intent to clients. And there was a lot of graphic design elements involved in that. And I think so that was kind of like a little bit of a taste of some of that, I think. But what really was the catalyst for me to change was that I had worked on in my last career, the last project I had worked on was a private school. And this was kind of in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I had been working on this project for about 4 years, and design and overseeing construction. And the building had just opened, and I had walking around speaking to some of the teachers who were going to be teaching in the building and just having conversations with them. They were all really, the feedback was great. They were all very excited and happy about the new building, and they were really looking forward to teaching there. But in one particular case, I was speaking with a science teacher, and she had expressed her frustration of teaching over Zoom calls. And, I spent the last several years on this project where we've kind of meticulously thought out and planned, met all the programmatic requirements, really pushed the design forward in the sense of like the client's expectations, or really designed this beautiful building. And when it came down to that conversation around this frustration of teaching over Zoom, there's nothing I could do as an architect really to help, to really help solve that problem, right? Like once a building is built, more or less, like it's relatively unchangeable. Definitely certain treatments you can do, but it just made me realize that architecture couldn't respond to this like rapid changing nature of reality that something like software had this outsized impact on. And I just felt like Well, if I could channel my design skills and sensibilities toward software design or product design, that scale of impact could not only meet like the demands of this ever-changing world, but also has this like much larger global impact versus sometimes building has significant impact as well, but it really constrained to this kind of like neighborhood level or community level, right? And that's great. You know, I'm definitely not knocking that by any means, but it that conversation definitely started to get the wheels turning in my head around like, hey, maybe I should pivot and focus some of my design efforts toward a different career.
Maybe the next question ties a little bit into that.
Mhm.
In the past, I've worked with a number of UX professionals who had a background in architecture, and for some reason, they always seem to be very good at their job. What are the similarities between architecture and UX or product design that make former architects better prepared for roles in UX or product design?
I think, and I touched on this a little bit earlier with the kind of cross disciplinary collaboration. I think much of the work an architect does is in coordinating a large team of engineers and contractors and clients to realize a design. Traditionally, architects in a normal architectural project, they're the team lead for the entire project and they kind of orchestrate all of the other folks, all the engineering consultants on the team. They orchestrate everybody so that all of the work that's done is on schedule, is aligned. And so there's this like natural element of like project ownership, I think, that just comes with the role there as an architect. And I think that's a huge factor. I think there's this like in product design, oftentimes like we bifurcate the roles of, and this is not always the case, but a lot of times the product management is its own domain, and then design is its own domain. In architecture, that role is often combined. So there's a lot of like PM work being done by the architect. So I do think there's a lot of experience in that regard to help. Those skills are very translatable toward the product design role. And in addition to that, I think we also have a very similar iterative design process. Albeit that it's a bit slower than kind of rapid sprints and product cycles you see in UX, but there's a lot of parallels in terms of like, you design something, you get feedback from a wider group of stakeholders, you go back and you make some changes, and that kind of the double diamond process is something that's common in the architectural industry as well. We call it different things, but design thinking is very prevalent there. So I think there's a lot of those parallels really play a big part in. I think when I speak to architects who've transitioned to UX, I think there's this natural fit that really helps them excel in the product designer role.
I want to go back to that moment that you were thinking about transitioning to UX, because there are, of course, a number of ways to educate yourself about UX. You choose to do a bootcamp. Why is that? And what did you expect from a bootcamp?
When I was considering different ways or different avenues of making the career switch, one option was definitely the master's degree route, right? And it's pretty common. I live here in the Seattle region, and University of Washington has this excellent human computer interaction design program that's quite reputable across the industry. So I was definitely interested in that. It did come with an enormous cost, with no option for scholarship. So that was one large factor in kind of me not going down that route. I also spoke to some folks, actually some previous architects who went through that program, and what I heard from them was that there's a lot of value in it, but there's also a lot of redundancy in terms of like maybe that program is more appropriate for folks without a strong design experience background. And so I felt like, knowing that, I made the decision to, for better or worse, to kind of go maybe a non-traditional route and try boot camp. At first, I thought I could do it on my own and self-teach, but I also know that I need a bit of structure, and it's nice to have this a regular cadence. Otherwise, I'm not really. It's sometimes I don't hold myself accountable for slipping in terms of like educating myself. So I did some research and found that design lab might be a good fit. And so that was really kind of the reason why I chose the boot camp, was that I felt like I did have a good design foundation that allowed me to maybe not necessarily need to do a master's degree, but I also did need some structure around like developing projects and getting some feedback on that. So
Talking about cadence, talking about structure, how did you manage your time with a UX bootcamp and your daily activities?
I had the luxury of not working and focusing on bootcamp full time. So this might not necessarily apply to, some of the listeners that are listening, but um, I felt that it was valuable to really focus my efforts on the transition. And what that allowed me to do was really dive deeper into the thinking behind my portfolio projects. It gave me time to really learn prototyping. So, for example, I spent a lot of time in Protopy and Framer. I also didn't know a whole lot of HTML and CSS when I embarked on my journey, and so it gave me time to go on these, because that's not essential for the boot camp to understand some of that, but understanding the way things are constructed really, I kind of carry this from my architectural background. Understanding how a building goes together makes you a better designer, and I feel the same is exactly true for product design. And so it really allowed me to spend more time on learning some of those kind of, I struggle to call them adjacent paths, but like these other kind of and I really do think it paid dividends. I think when I look at folks that do the boot camp while they have a full-time job, kudos to them. Like it's such a challenge to do. And I really had the privilege of, having enough savings to be able to kind of focus on this full time. So balancing my time wasn't too much of a struggle because of that, but I did have opportunities there to really lean into learning a little bit more about other things for sure.
You've already said that you, when you were an architect, already had an interest in user interfaces. Were there any challenges for you to master that specific part?
Yeah, master is an interesting word. I feel like I'm still on that journey. I'm certainly not the strongest visual designer. I consider myself pretty average. But I think when it came to the UI portion, I didn't have any apprehension or struggle with that. Just by nature of working in Illustrator quite a bit as an architect and just having kind of a strong intuition about like what feels right. And that's not, that's very subjective, and it's definitely a muscle you develop over time. But I felt like I had at least spent some time in the quote unquote gym, the visual design gym, to kind of hit the ground running when it came to the UI part. I don't think I struggled a whole lot there. There's definitely other facets that were a little bit more challenging and net new to my experience as a designer, but I felt pretty comfortable with the UI portion of the bootcamp.
And how about the research part of the bootcamp?
Yes, that was definitely the kind of newer experience that I had to really get comfortable with over time. As an architect, we definitely have client sessions where we interview the client, ask them about their needs and desires and all that. But it really only happens at the beginning of the project, and it's not this continual process. In terms of research portion of the boot camp, I think what I really had to learn was to fight this instinct to find common ground with the research participants and kind of affirm their reactions. Like a lot of times when somebody says something, I want to acknowledge that verbally, or just make them feel heard. And I think sometimes that gets in the way of just being silent. Oftentimes you get the most value by just allowing the speaker to take the time that they need to really think something through and vocalize it. And so I had to learn a bit about just being quiet and kind of being aloof in research sessions and not influencing a whole lot of the participants' perspective on things by head nodding or anything like that. So that was kind of an interesting challenge for sure.
Was creating a portfolio challenge for you?
I would say yes, in terms that I spent a lot of time on the portfolio. I really felt that that was really key, especially at the time that I had started looking for jobs. Was kind of right around the time the massive layoffs had already occurred a few months prior, and this is in early 2022, I believe, or 2023. Yeah, there was quite a bit of layoffs. There's quite a bit of talent looking for jobs, a lot of competition out there. And I really felt that in looking at other folks, their portfolios from the boot camp, that there seemed to be this common theme. And this is not by any means like knocking anyone's work or anything like that, but I realized that there was a need to stand out, especially in the kind of like, if job applications are getting thousands of applicants, like there's got to be a way. It's really important to just have that a portfolio really shine upon first glance. And so I spent a lot of time on that. So I do feel like it was a challenge. I ended up doing a lot of custom coding of my portfolio, and I didn't have any coding experience going into that. And I really wanted to have the interactions be polished. So that's the reason why I did that. And this was actually when I think ChatGPT was just coming out and getting real popular adoption. And so this was in early 2023. I actually I used it to help me code, and it wasn't the best back then, but it was enough to get by. And so I spent a lot of time on it. So it was definitely a challenge, I would say, but I think it paid dividends.
What is the biggest misconception about UX bootcamps?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the trend of the boot camp is definitely has shifted, in recent years. I think that was probably a more popular avenue for folks to transition back when, maybe 5, 10 years ago, when there was more abundant jobs, especially in the US. I think one common misconception that comes from that was that, like, oh, if I just simply graduate and just check all the boxes, that I'm ready to become a professional. And what's the challenging part about boot camps is that the nature of the projects that you work on don't really have a lot of basis in reality, and they don't really reflect the actual process that happens, especially if you're working in a larger company. There's just, if you have limited amount of design experience or collaboration experience, I think it's going to be a real challenge. But I would say that a common misconception is that it's just simply, going through and having a portfolio of capstone projects is enough. I think you really have to pair that with some kind of past professional experience, and that doesn't necessarily have to be in design, but if you're a great communicator and you're a teacher or you're a nurse, that is very applicable. And I think leaning into that is really important. But I don't think it's something that the boot camp is excels at teaching folks.
I've heard from a number of people who I've interviewed before that they said it actually kind of helps if you have a career or a previous career that is adjacent towards UX. What do you think about that?
I would agree to a extent. I would say it depends on your domain expertise. I think if you are involved in healthcare, not at all related in design, and you transition into the UX field and you work at a healthcare company, I think you bring this rich domain expertise to that role. And I think that's very valuable. So I agree. I think like having familiarity with the design process and just how organic and how non-linear that is very helpful for sure. It's I don't think it's a prerequisite at all, but I think it's very valuable. But I do think, like, if you don't have that, but you come to UX with this experience that's outside of design but quite rich in a different field, I think you can bring a lot of interesting knowledge and become a subject matter expert in that field that you're working in. So
And what is, in your opinion, the biggest misconception about being a product designer?
hmm, that's a good one. I'm still learning about what that is, just by nature of being so new to the industry. But I think a lot of folks outside of product design, or maybe early in the transition period, believe that maybe the role indexes quite a bit on like pixel pushing or the actual act of wireframing or prototyping design. I've really found that's not been the case, right? A lot of the job as a product designer is kind of soft skills. It's a lot of communication, a lot of alignment with various stakeholders. It's a ton of storytelling. It's a lot of storytelling, and just being able to curate that story to make sure everybody that you're working with is coming along the way with you, and that the end result makes sense. And so there's a lot of strategic thinking that doesn't necessarily involve Figma work. So I think I think somebody who's not so familiar with the industry might think, well, maybe you're spending, you know, 80-90% of your day just moving boxes around, making things beautiful. And that's really not the case. And I'm generalizing a bit. I think it really depends on what role you play. If you're more of the visual designer, that might be the case, right? But if we're thinking about like a traditional product designer role where you're responsible not only for design but for that strategic level kind of thinking and just coordination with a bunch of stakeholders, there's a lot of that. I feel that takes up a lot of the day, actually, a lot of meetings, a lot of storytelling. So
How did you land your first role? And can you tell us about your first projects and how you interacted with your teammates as the new product designer?
yeah, sure. I actually found my first role while I was still enrolled in boot camp, and this role was as a solo UX designer contractor, and it was for a very small data analytics startup. And by very small, I mean like it was like a team of five, so it was very tiny. It was only a 3 month stint, and although I did work closely with a creative director, there wasn't any sense of like design maturity in the sense that like there was no formalized process in place. There weren't any assets. I had to create everything net new, and so it was a great learning experience. Having that as as a first project was I think it was a real challenge because I had to really learn a lot about management of my own time, and I had to craft my own contract. I had to estimate schedule, have a schedule of deliverables, and make sure that like research plan, all this stuff that as a solo designer and having that as the first job felt a bit overwhelming at times. It was great to have very accommodating team they were very nice and very understanding and very open and very communicative. So that played a big part in like that experience feeling successful. But it was quite interesting as a first foray into the field, because to contrast with that, with my experience today, I work in a very large enterprise, and it's night and day, right? I get to work with a large team of designers and PMs and engineers, and I have a lot of resources whenever I run into any issues. And so I certainly prefer that, just in terms of a learning experience versus being a solo designer. But I do see benefits in having experience in both, right? Like it really holds you accountable in a lot of ways for the work you do, where I mean you still have accountability in a large org, but it's just a different game for sure. But
When you look back from when you first started to where you are now, where do you see the most growth in your development as a product designer?
I would say the kind of strategic thinking aspect for sure. When I first started out as a designer, it was more of the kind of UI intensive kind of design aspect of things. And in my current role, I would say most of the work I do is around storytelling and curation. And that was a muscle I didn't really get to flex a whole lot, either in my first role or as an architect. I spent a lot of time on technical things. But I think what's interesting about my growth over the last year has been just really around how to tell a story, like who the audience is, understanding who the audience is, how to tell a story that's cohesive and coherent, and really make sure that there's alignment with stakeholders. And so I think that facet of work is something I've had a lot of experience in over the year, and it's definitely been uh, growing pains, but it's been great.
And do you experience friction between user needs and business goals?
Yes. I mean, I think anyone working in the enterprise world will relate to this for sure. Sometimes there can be quite a bit of distance from the user. And this really depends on kind of the team and the org that you work in, of course. But, although, I have access to a ton of research and often sit in on sessions and make sure that our designs are accounting for user feedback. There's often this process of the shareholder alignment, and oftentimes these shareholders have diverse goals, and it often means that advocating for the user becomes a difficult process when there's a lot of other voices that might have more power in that team dynamic. And so it's always our duty as designers to advocate for the user, but at the end of the day, another set of users that you have is your stakeholder team. And so oftentimes those can um, conflict with one another. So there's definitely moments where there's friction for sure, where a business goal trumps a user need, and everyone is aware of that in the design team and expresses kind of frustration around that. Sometimes that's just the nature of working in large enterprises as well.
And what did product design give you that architecture couldn't? And what did architecture give you that product design can't?
Product design, it's interesting because it's cool that the work you do has this potential global impact and has this real heightened awareness. Like tech in general has a heightened awareness in society in terms of like if you work for a large company, like if you ship a bad product, you're going to hear about it across all kinds of different channels. And it's really interesting to see. You can see people's live reactions across all kinds of different platforms. There's a difference in feedback, I would say, in product design, where in architecture there's a lot of, for better or worse, there's not a whole lot of like user feedback after the product, a quote unquote product has shipped, what your building is complete. There's a lot of navel gazing as well. A lot of architecture looks beautiful on the cover of a magazine, and that could be a very different experience once you enter the building and experience it in reality. And I think with product design, if your thing is shiny but it sucks, I think you're going to hear about it from a large customer base, right? Depending on the product you're working on. So I think that feedback mechanism is really different and interesting, and I kind of like how pervasive that is for product design. That offers like a real like lens at this product you thought was awesome, or your whole team thought was awesome. Like all these other people don't think it's awesome, and there's reason why, and it's really interesting. I think that feedback mechanism is really interesting there. And I think there was a second part to that question I might have forgotten.
What did architecture give you that product design can't?
Yeah, I think, well, there's nothing quite like walking through a building that you had spent many years kind of toiling over. Uh, there's just like real intimate experience of like seeing this thing that's larger than you are physically, that you've been working, you've seen it on the screen for so long, and you've worked with a giant team of people to really come together. And I think that experience pales a bit in comparison to like if you have a certain feature in an app that shipped, and of course it depends on like how broad that feature is or how impactful it is. And I just don't have the experience maybe to see the end result of that quite yet. But for me, that was a real awesome moment as an architect. It was like, wow, like people really value this thing that I help build, right? And I think that's it's hard to find a analogous experience in product design, at least so far in my career.
I would like to look at UX for product design more from a more broader perspective. What does the future of UX or product design look like, in your opinion?
Well, if you ask the industry today, it's the future of UX is agentic, right? That's the hot thing right now is agents. But I think we're really at this inflection point in the industry in terms of where we have this nascent AI technology that's really coming on board and really starting to be integrated in kind of everything we do. And as these AI capabilities become more sophisticated, I think that role of the designer from this kind of you know digital labor of pixel pushing is going to take a backseat to some of the more higher order cognitive tasks that are more strategic in nature. So you can imagine a world where, and Figma has already announced some AI features to where like wireframes can be generated through prompting. And obviously there's some pitfalls around that, and they've had to recall some of their work. We're at a phase where that's the worst it's going to be. Like AI is only going to progressively become more capable. And I think it's naive to think that AI won't absorb the role of the pixel pusher over time. Like I think we should almost celebrate that to a degree. I think there will still be a degree of work there for sure. It's not going to do everything, but what it's going to do is it's going to be able to compress the timeline around like design optioneering or cycles, right? And just instead of us having to create everything from scratch, like suddenly we can start from square one with AI. And it really that does is help pushes the conversation forward. And I think it starts to become more about like that strategic level work that designers do, and it becomes more humanizing actually to a degree where like if the AI can do a lot of, mapping wireframes to the PRDs, right? Like to basic product requirements. It's some of that work is can be very tedious. You can imagine like naming your layers in Figma, right? Like this kind of organizational things that are routine. If that takes up a lot of your day, imagine like what you work on when AI assumes those responsibilities for you. I think it's an interesting question for everyone to ask themselves. Like, what could I be working on if I didn't have to spend all my time naming my layers or moving these boxes around, right? Like, because design is not only in Figma, design exists in many regards outside of Figma. And so I think there's going to be a kind of paradigm shift, if you will, over time, the designer having expanded responsibilities. And I also think I'm not a design engineer by any means. I don't have a strong background, but I could see another facet of this being more emphasis on folks that have technical knowledge and design engineers becoming more and more prevalent and more common within teams, right? Like folks that are not only able to have a strong design sensibility but also can help ship something and really help on the technical end of things, right? And so I think it's very interesting because I see like two divergent paths there where it's maybe there's more strategic work and there's even more technical work that's also assisted by AI, right? Like I think we can use AI for coding today. In the future, we're going to be able to use those tools for design. And I think just all the above really and just becoming more proficient and more capable as one person can have a lot more impact in 2 years from now versus today, right? So I think it's going to change quite a bit, actually.
And based on what you just said, what would you advise a person who wants to transition to UX, and what should they look at when they choose UX education? Either that is a bootcamp or maybe a degree.
Yeah, I think one, the first thing is not to be put off by any of like these like the market as it exists today, right? It's a tough market out there for folks. There's also like that the question of like how will AI change the nature of my work? I don't think like those should be things that are preventing you from wanting to pursue a career here. I think there's abundant opportunity afforded by new technologies. I think there's only going to be an increase in demand over time for design. But I do think that as somebody who's transitioning to UX, I think if you're truly interested in entering the field, I think this is something I think I wish I would have done more of in my journey was talk to as many professionals as you can, often as you can. There's great resources for this, like ADP list, where you can really reach out to folks that are in, I would recommend talking to people all across like spectrum of like experience levels, different market sectors, different scales of companies, different roles, just to collect like this knowledge of what's out there because you know there's so many different types of roles that you could work in. The spectrum is quite vast, so I think that would really help somebody gain a better understanding versus watching YouTube or kind of learning secondhand from folks about what the profession is. I think really just treat it like a user interview and talk to folks out there that are actually working in those industries. I think that's going to be invaluable to the process of the transitioning. I also think that having a plan would be great. My journey was I was quite burned out at my last job as an architect, and I quit without really a strong plan of how I wanted to go about transitioning. And I think so it took a bit longer than I expected to make that transition. And I think given the nature of the job market today, if you're listening today in 2024, the market's still pretty difficult. And I think just understanding that, there's a lot of competition out there and just planning your time and budget and making sure that you have, maybe you are, you have a job while you're learning and just have some kind of plan. I think is valuable because there's definitely times in my job hunting experience where after my first role in the contract role, that dried up, and then I was looking for jobs for a few months. It's very difficult, right? Even if you have savings, like it can be a very tough process mentally, right? And so I think just being prepared for that, just having a realistic expectations is really key. And lastly, I would say, I think finding a great mentor is really key. And I had the pleasure of working with you, Robert, in Design Lab, and I think that was hugely influential to my development and my understanding what UX really is. Because I think it's important to have somebody who can challenge you and, in some sense, speak openly, and in some circumstances bluntly, right? Because that really is more constructive to your development as a designer versus just hearing what you want to hear, or having somebody that maybe doesn't have great feedback or really challenges you. I think finding a mentor that can challenge you will pay huge dividends. And I was really lucky to work with you, Robert, in Design Lab, and have that opportunity to kind of hear your perspective and have you tell me when my designs didn't make sense, and how I could better approach something, for sure.
I very much appreciate that, Brandon. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time today. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast or have any feedback, please leave a message. I wish you all the best in your journey, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.